Today, we invite you to embark on a thrilling journey alongside a seasoned veteran, Jonas Keene, and his two extraordinary canine companions, Atlas, the German Shepherd, and Luna, the Husky. As we delve into the heart of an unfolding mystery, prepare to have your
Oh my
perceptions
goodness.
challenged
Whimpers.
and your spirit stirred. For the tale before you is not merely one of survival, but of ancient echoes and a secret so profound it would shake even the stoic mountains of Montana. Jonas Keene, a former Marine, now seeking solace in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American wilderness, believed he had merely performed an act of compassion by rescuing two desperate stray dogs. Yet, as the biting Montana winter deepened its icy grip, the ordinary quickly dissolved into the extraordinary. After a period of quiet recovery within the sanctuary of Jonas's remote cabin, the German Shepherd, Atlas, and the Husky, Luna, began to exhibit a behavior that transcended mere animal instinct. Day after day, their intelligent eyes, one pair amber, the other piercing blue, would fixate upon a single, unchanging point, deep within the dense, snow-laden forest. Low, urgent whines, imbued with a desperate urgency, would ripple from their chests, a melody of distress that spoke volumes beyond spoken words. This was no lingering trauma from their past ordeal. This was a meticulously crafted message, a silent plea, echoing through the ancient pines, trusting the profound, wordless connection forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. Jonas, a man whose instincts had been honed on distant battlefields, could not ignore their call. He followed Atlas and Luna for hours through the treacherous, snow-choked wilderness of Montana. The path they carved was not on any map, but one etched by memory and an unwavering sense of purpose, leading them to a site that defied explanation, a forgotten, dilapidated cabin, its rough-hewn door secured by a heavy padlock from the outside. Yet, against all logic, a thin, the spectral wisp of smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, a ghostly signal of life within an otherwise desolate tomb. Someone was trapped inside. What ancient secret, what harrowing truth, was being held captive within that isolated, frozen prison, waiting for a veteran and his loyal pack to unearth it? Join us now, as the icy winds whisper tales of desperation, and the wilderness prepares to unveil its most guarded secrets. The silence in the mountains of Montana was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered sound and thought alike. For Jonas Keene, a former Marine, it was the only medicine that had ever worked. At 35 years old, his tall frame was leaner than it had been in the Marine Corps, but the strength was still there, coiled in the muscles of his arms and back. His short brown hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, and his face, etched with lines of hardship, held a kindness in the eyes that even the horrors of war could not extinguish. He had retreated to this remote cabin, his late grandfather David's final sanctuary, seeking an escape from the ghosts that followed him from the desert sands. Dressed against the biting cold in an old brown leather jacket, left unzipped over a plaid flannel shirt, faded blue jeans, and sturdy work boots, Jonas moved with a quiet purpose that belied the turmoil within. The cabin was his fortress, a simple structure of dark, weathered logs nestled among towering pines. He knew nothing of its deeper history, nothing of the memories it held for others. He was unaware that many years ago, this very cabin had served as a beacon of safety in the memory of a German Shepherd named Atlas and a Husky named Luna, loyal companions who had visited this place with their owner, a dear friend of David's. For Jonas, it was just a place to be alone, a place where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the crackle of the fire. The winter had been relentless, burying the landscape under a thick shroud of white. Snow clung to the branches of the pines, weighing them down like weary shoulders. Each day was a simple routine: chop wood, check the snares, maintain the cabin, and stare into the flames, trying to burn away the images that haunted his sleep. He had come here to forget, to let the silence heal the wounds that no one could see. He had not expected it to be broken. The storm began in the late afternoon, a whisper that quickly grew into a roar. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind howled through the valley like a hungry wolf. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal torrent that erased the world outside his window. Jonas secured the shutters, added another log to the roaring fire in the stone hearth, and settled into his grandfather's worn armchair. The cabin groaned under the assault of the blizzard, but it was solid, built by hands that understood the fury of a Montana winter. He closed his eyes, letting the storm's chaos drown out the noise in his head. It was hours later, deep in the night, when he first heard it, a faint, desperate scratching at the heavy oak door. At first, he dismissed it as a branch scraping against the wood, a trick of the wind, but the sound came again, weaker this time, followed by low, mournful whines that were almost lost in the gale. It was the sound of living creatures. Adrenaline, a familiar and unwelcome companion, surged through him. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, his movements swift and silent. Who or what could be out there in a storm like this? A lost wolf, perhaps, or a mountain lion driven by hunger. He moved to the door, listening intently. The scratching had stopped, but he could sense a presence on the other side, fragile lives fading in the cold. Taking a deep breath, he unlatched the heavy bar, securing the door, and pulled it inward just enough to see. A blast of wind and snow rushed into the warm cabin, and there, collapsed on his doorstep, were two dogs. It was a magnificent German shepherd, Atlas, its thick coat, a beautiful mix of gray and white, now matted with ice, and what looked alarmingly like blood. Beside him, a beautiful husky, Luna, lay nearly buried in a fresh drift of snow, her blue eyes barely open. The animals were barely breathing, their powerful forms limp, a testament to a battle lost against the elements, and something far worse. Without a second thought, Jonas swung the door wide open. Atlas lifted his head weakly, his intelligent eyes meeting his for a brief moment, while Luna managed a faint whimper before their strength gave out completely. These were Atlas and Luna, creatures driven by the faint, lingering memory of a safe haven from their youth, a desperate, instinctual pilgrimage to the one place they knew might hold salvation. They had made it, but just barely. Jonas's training took over. He knelt in the snow, his hands expertly and gently running over the dogs' bodies, checking for the source of the bleeding. He found a deep gash on Atlas's flank, and several smaller wounds on both dogs that looked jagged and unnatural. This was no accident. "Easy, boys. Girls, you're safe now," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He carefully scooped Atlas into his arms, surprised by its weight, then gently lifted Luna and carried them inside, kicking the door shut against the raging storm. He laid the animals on the thick bearskin rug in front of the fireplace, the warmth of the flames beginning to thaw the ice from their fur. Jonas retrieved his old military first aid kit, its contents familiar and reassuring in his hands. He worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wounds, applying antiseptic, and skillfully stitching the worst of Atlas's gashes and tending to Luna's injuries. The dogs remained unconscious, their breathing shallow but steady. As he worked, Jonas felt a connection to these brave animals, a shared understanding of survival, of enduring pain, in a world that had turned hostile. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet rhythm of three souls, one saving the others, bound together by the fury of the storm. The world was born again in silence. The blizzard had exhausted its fury during the night, leaving behind a landscape of pristine, sculpted white under a brilliant morning sun. Jonas woke on the armchair, a stiff crick in his neck, the fire in the hearth, reduced to a bed of glowing red embers. His first conscious thought was of the dogs. He looked toward the bearskin rug and found two pairs of intelligent eyes watching him. Atlas and Luna were awake. They had not moved from their spot. But their posture was different. There was an alertness in their gaze, a quiet dignity that defied the suffering they had endured. They were creatures of immense strength, not just of body, but of spirit. Jonas rose slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the animals. "Hey there, boys and girls," he said softly. "Welcome back." Atlas's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. He made a low sound in his throat, not a growl, but a soft rumble of acknowledgement. Luna gave a soft wag of her tail. They watched as Jonas added wood to the fire, coaxing the embers back to life, until flames licked at the fresh logs. The warmth began to fill the cabin once more. Jonas brought bowls of fresh water and set them down a few feet from the dogs. "Take it easy," he advised. "Just water for now." Atlas and Luna watched the bowls for a long moment. Then slowly, painfully, they pushed themselves up onto their front legs. Their back legs trembled with the effort, but they held their position. They stretched their necks forward and began to drink, their laps slow and deliberate. When they were finished, they lay back down, their breathing a little heavier, and fixed their gaze on Jonas again. There was no fear in those eyes, only a profound, weary watchfulness. Later that morning, with the light streaming through the clean-swept window, Jonas knew he had to properly tend to the dog's injuries. The work he had done by firelight had been a desperate patch job. "All right, Atlas, Luna," he said, approaching slowly with his medical kit. "Let's get a better look at you." He knelt beside the dogs, who remained still, their eyes following Jonas's every move. They seemed to understand that this human was here to help. Jonas began by gently cleaning the area around the large gash on Atlas's flank. As he wiped away the dried blood and applied a fresh layer of antiseptic, he saw it clearly for the first time. The edges of the wound were clean, too clean. There were no ragged tears consistent with an animal's claw or tooth. It looked more like a cut, a deliberate slice made by a sharp object. A cold knot formed in Jonas's stomach. His suspicion grew as he examined the dog's other injuries. He found what he had missed in the dark: raw, chafed skin, encircling both Atlas's and Luna's front paws. Hidden beneath the thick fur, the marks were unmistakable, the kind left by rope or wire pulled tight, a sign of being bound. His hands paused. He had seen marks like these before, on people in places he tried hard to forget. These dogs had not just been injured. They had been restrained. They had been tortured. A quiet rage, cold and sharp, settled over him. This was not the work of nature, the brutal but honest violence of the wild. This was the calculated cruelty of a human being. He looked at Atlas and Luna, who met his gaze without flinching, and a wave of profound empathy washed over him. He understood, in a way few could, what it meant to be at the mercy of someone else's malice. He saw not just animals, but fellow survivors, other soldiers who had seen the worst of the world and somehow made it through. He finished his work in silence, his movements gentle and precise. He restitched Atlas's gash with greater care, bandaged the smaller cuts on both dogs, and applied a soothing salve to the raw skin on their legs. Throughout the entire process, Atlas and Luna remained perfectly still, enduring the sting of the antiseptic without so much as a whimper. They had placed their complete trust in this stranger. Over the next few days, a quiet routine formed between the three of them. Jonas cared for Atlas and Luna, feeding them small meals of softened jerky and warm broth, ensuring they always had fresh water, and checking their wounds twice a day. Atlas and Luna, in return, offered their silent companionship. Their presence filled the vast, oppressive emptiness of the cabin. Jonas found himself talking to the dogs, telling them about the weather, about the book he was reading, about anything at all. The words came easily, a release from the solitary confinement he had imposed upon himself. Atlas and Luna were patient listeners. They would watch Jonas with that unwavering, intelligent gaze, their heads cocked to one side, as if they understood every word. Their strength returned slowly but surely. By the third day, they could stand on all four legs, and by the fourth, they took their first hesitant steps across the cabin floor, Atlas's tail giving a single weak wag, Luna nudging his hand. They would follow Jonas from the fireplace to the kitchen, their paws making a soft padding sound on the wooden floorboards, a constant reassuring presence at his side. One afternoon, as Jonas sat cleaning his rifle, a task he performed out of habit more than necessity, Atlas came and rested his great head on Jonas's knee. While Luna settled beside him, leaning against his leg, Jonas stopped what he was doing and looked down into those amber and blue eyes. He saw a loyalty there that was absolute, a bond forged in the crucible of a snowstorm, and sealed by a shared understanding of pain. He reached down and stroked Atlas's thick fur, scratching behind his ears, and then gently pet Luna. Both dogs leaned into the touch, deep sighs of contentment escaping them. In that moment, the crushing weight of Jonas's solitude lifted, replaced by the steady, grounding presence of these resilient creatures. They were three broken souls, a man and two dogs, who had found each other in the heart of a merciless winter. And in the quiet companionship they offered each other, they had both begun to heal. A week passed. The rhythm of life in the cabin shifted, finding a new, quieter cadence. The oppressive silence that Jonas had once sought as a shield had been replaced by the soft sounds of companionship, the gentle pad of Atlas's and Luna's paws on the wood floor, the contented sighs of the dogs sleeping by the fire, the occasional clink of their collars. Atlas's and Luna's physical wounds were healing with remarkable speed. The stitches on Atlas's flank were clean, and the raw skin on their legs had begun to heal over, covered by the first fuzz of new fur. They were eating well, their strength returning with each passing day. For the first time in years, Jonas felt a sense of peace settle over him. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their sharp edges blunted by the grounding presence of the dogs. He had a purpose beyond his own survival. He had someone to care for, and in turn, he felt cared for. The bond between them had deepened into a silent, profound understanding. They were a pack of three, veterans of different wars, finding solace in their shared solitude. But as Atlas's and Luna's bodies healed, something restless began to stir within their spirits. It started suddenly. Jonas would catch the dogs standing by the large window that faced the dense northern stretch of the forest, their bodies rigid, their gazes fixed on a point deep within the trees that Jonas could not see. Their ears would be perked forward, every muscle tense, as if listening to a sound only they could hear. Then came the whining. It was not the sound of pain, but a low, mournful, and deeply urgent noise that vibrated with a strange anxiety. "What is it, boys and girls?" Jonas asked the first time it happened, walking over to stand beside them. "See a deer out there." Atlas and Luna didn't acknowledge him. Their focus was absolute, their entire beings directed toward that unseen point in the wilderness. They shifted their weight from one paw to another, their bodies trembling slightly. Jonas looked out, scanning the endless expanse of snow and pine, but saw nothing but the serene, indifferent beauty of the mountains. At first, Jonas attributed it to the trauma Atlas and Luna had endured. He had seen men in his unit stare off into the distance, their minds replaying horrors on a loop that no one else could see. He figured the dogs were doing the same, their memories haunted by whatever had happened to them in those woods. He would try to distract them, calling their names in a cheerful voice, offering a piece of jerky, or grabbing the leashes for a walk, but Atlas and Luna would ignore it all, their distress growing, until Jonas gently led them away from the window. The behavior, however, did not subside. It intensified. Atlas and Luna began to pace, a restless, agitated circuit from the window to the door, and then to Jonas, before returning to the window again. The whining became more frequent, more insistent. It was the sound of creatures trying desperately to communicate something they had no words for. They would stop in front of Jonas, look up at him with those intelligent amber and blue eyes, and let out soft, pleading whimpers, before turning their heads sharply toward the door. The message was becoming clearer. They needed to go out there. They needed Jonas to follow. It's just ghosts. Atlas, Luna. Jonas found himself saying one evening, trying to soothe the agitated animals, and perhaps himself, "They're not real. You're safe here." But as he looked into the dog's eyes, he saw something that wasn't fear. It wasn't the panicked, unfocused look of a tormented memory. It was intelligence. It was purpose. There was a desperate clarity in their gaze, an unwavering conviction that chilled Jonas to the bone. These were not dogs lost in the past. These were dogs with a mission in the present. The turning point came on a cold, clear afternoon. Jonas was sitting at the heavy wooden table, cleaning his hunting knife. When Atlas and Luna approached, the dogs didn't whine or pace. Instead, they stood directly in front of Jonas and nudged his hand with their cold, wet noses. A single, deliberate push. Jonas stopped what he was doing and looked at them. Atlas held his gaze for a long moment. Then he and Luna turned, walked to the cabin door, and sat looking back over their shoulders. It was the most direct, unambiguous plea they could have possibly made. In that moment, all of Jonas's rationalizations fell away. The training that had been drilled into him in the Marine Corps, the instinct that had kept him alive in the most hostile places on Earth, screamed at him to pay attention. You trust your partner. You listen to the one watching your back. He looked at the proud, resilient animals sitting by the door, and he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that Atlas and Luna were not haunted. They were calling for help. The sounds they heard were not echoes of the past. They were a cry from the present, a call from someone else who was in trouble deep in the winter woods. They were trying to tell him something vital. Jonas slowly put down his knife. He stood up and walked to the closet where he kept his gear. Atlas and Luna watched him, low whines of anticipation rumbling in their chests. "Okay, boys and girls," Jonas said, his voice quiet but firm. "Okay, you win." He pulled out his heavy-duty winter coat, his pack, and the rifle he kept propped in the corner. He wasn't just going for a walk. He was going on a mission. He did not know what they would find out there, but he knew he could no longer ignore the call. He owed it to the brave animals who had fought their way through a blizzard to find him. He owed it to the silent pact they had made in front of the fire. "Show me," Jonas said, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "Show me what has you so worried." Atlas and Luna rose to their feet, their tails giving single, powerful wags. They stood by the door, their bodies quivering with a focused, urgent energy, ready to lead the way. The moment Jonas opened the cabin door, the sheer scale of the wilderness seemed to press in on them. The cold was a clean, sharp blade against his skin, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of his boots on the fresh powder. The world outside was a vast, unforgiving expanse of white and shadow, the towering pines standing like silent sentinels over a frozen kingdom. For a moment, the rational part of his mind questioned the sanity of this venture, stepping out into the heart of a Montana winter on the wordless plea of two dogs. But then he looked down. Atlas and Luna stood beside him, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a calm, focused intensity. Their breath plumed in the frigid air, and their eyes were fixed on the tree line. There was no doubt in their posture, no hesitation. They were soldiers ready to lead their patrol. Jonas felt his own military instincts take over, pushing aside the last vestiges of uncertainty. He adjusted the weight of the pack on his shoulders, its contents chosen with years of experience. A compact first aid kit, high-energy protein bars, a canteen of water wrapped in wool to keep from freezing, a waterproof container with matches and a fire starter, and a compass. The rifle slung over his shoulder felt familiar and steadying, a tool he hoped he would not need. Atlas gave a soft woof, a quiet command, and then moved. Luna followed closely. They did not bound into the deep snow, but trotted with a powerful, efficient gait, their strong legs finding purchase where a human would flounder. They were not just running, they were leading. Jonas fell into step behind them, his own long-legged stride eating up the ground. They moved as a unit, a man and two dogs, against the immense, indifferent wilderness. The path Atlas and Luna chose was not a path at all. It was a route born of instinct and memory. They led them through dense stands of pine, their snow-laden branches forming a low, dark canopy over their heads. They navigated around massive fallen logs, their ancient wood covered in a thick blanket of white. They would pause at the edge of frozen streams, their heads low as they tested the air, before finding a safe place to cross. On thick, solid ice, Jonas watched them, impressed by their intelligence and sureness. The dogs moved with a knowledge of this forest that seemed innate, as if they were following a map invisible to human eyes. Several times, Atlas and Luna would stop, their bodies going completely still. They would lift their noses, tasting the wind, their ears swiveling to catch the faintest sound. Jonas would halt behind them, his own senses on high alert, scanning the trees for any sign of danger. But Atlas and Luna were not looking for predators. After a moment of concentration, they would turn with renewed certainty and continue on their chosen bearing. They were tracking something, not with scent, but with a purpose that burned within them. The deeper they went, the more difficult the terrain became. They ascended steep wooded hillsides, Jonas using the tree trunks to pull himself up through the thigh-deep snow. They descended into shadowed valleys, where the cold was even more profound, and the silence felt ancient and heavy. Through it all, Atlas and Luna never faltered. They would frequently look back, their amber and blue eyes checking on Jonas, waiting for him to catch up. A silent gesture of reassurance and partnership. Jonas would give a small nod, and the dogs would press on. The sun climbed higher in the pale blue sky, its light glinting off the endless sea of white. But its warmth barely penetrated the frigid air. They had been walking for hours. Jonas's muscles ached with the strain of moving through the heavy snow, but he pushed on, driven by the dog's unwavering resolve. He was no longer just a man seeking solitude. He was a marine on a mission again. His focus narrowed to the objective, his trust placed entirely in his point men. Atlas and Luna, they were his partners, his scouts, and Jonas knew without a doubt that he would follow these dogs anywhere. They stopped only once, in a small clearing sheltered from the wind. Jonas took a long drink from his canteen, the water shockingly cold. He broke off a piece of a protein bar and offered it to Atlas and Luna, who took it gently from his gloved hand. The dogs ate quickly, then drank from the fresh snow, their energy seemingly limitless. They did not rest for long. Within minutes, they were on their feet again, looking expectantly at Jonas, their bodies angled toward the north. The urgency that had started in the cabin was still there, a low, the steady flame that the cold could not extinguish. "I'm coming, boys and girls," Jonas said, his voice a low cloud in the air. He shouldered his pack, the weight feeling less burdensome now, and they set off once more. The landscape grew wilder. The signs of human presence, even the distant logging roads he knew were miles behind them, had vanished completely. They were in the true heart of the mountains now, a place of stark, brutal beauty. And still Atlas and Luna led on, their gray and white forms moving specks of determination against the vast canvas of the forest, following the echo of a call that only they could hear. The sun had begun its descent toward the jagged western peaks, painting the endless snowfields in hues of orange and purple. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the cold, which had been a constant companion, was now starting to bite with real venom. Jonas's legs burned with fatigue, each step through the deep snow a monumental effort. He had been walking for what felt like an eternity, guided only by the unwavering determination of the dogs in front of him. Any lesser animals would have given up hours ago, but Atlas and Luna pressed on. Their purpose, a tangible force that pulled Jonas along in their wake. Just as a sliver of doubt began to creep back into Jonas's mind, Atlas's behavior changed. He stopped abruptly at the crest of a small hill, his body rigid, his head held high. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, the first aggressive sound Jonas had heard from him. Luna bristled beside him, a low warning bark, escaping her. Then, Atlas let out a single sharp bark that cut through the profound silence of the forest. He looked back at Jonas, his eyes blazing with a fierce urgency, before turning his attention forward once more. Jonas moved up beside them, his hand resting on the cold steel of his rifle. He followed the dog's gaze, and that is when he saw it. Barely visible against the darkening sky was a thin, almost imperceptible wisp of gray smoke, rising from beyond the next stand of ancient pines. It was a sign of life in a place that felt utterly devoid of it. Atlas and Luna needed no further encouragement. They plunged down the other side of the hill, their pace quickening. Jonas followed, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. His tactical training took over, and he moved with caution, using the trees for cover as they approached the source of the smoke. The trees thinned, revealing a small, desolate clearing. In its center stood a hunting cabin, a sad, dilapidated structure that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the wilderness. Its log walls were weathered to a pale gray, and one of its windows was boarded over. The roof sagged under the immense weight of accumulated snow, and the entire building listed to one side. If not for that faint curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, he would have assumed it had been abandoned decades ago. As they drew closer, Jonas noticed the snow around the cabin was an undisturbed blanket of white. There were no tracks leading away from it, meaning no one had left recently. But there was a single, narrow path leading to the front door, compressed by use before the last snowfall. Atlas's growling grew louder, a continuous, menacing rumble. Luna's barks became sharper. Then Jonas saw what had set the dogs on edge, what made his own blood run cold. A heavy, rusted chain was wrapped around the door handles, secured by a large, formidable padlock. The smoke meant someone was inside. The lock meant they were a prisoner. Easy, boys, girls, Jonas whispered, placing a hand on Atlas's back, then Luna's. But the dogs could not be calmed. Atlas lunged forward, scratching frantically at the wooden door, his whines now sharp with desperation. Luna joined in, pawing and barking. Jonas knelt beside the lock. It was old, but it was solid. He scanned the clearing one last time. They were utterly alone. There was no time to hesitate. "Stand back, Atlas. Luna," he commanded. He gripped his rifle, reversed it, and slammed the heavy stock against the padlock. The sound was a deafening crack in the frozen air. The old metal held. He struck it again. A powerful, focused blow, driven by years of training. The shackle groaned. On the third strike, the rusted metal finally gave way with a sharp snap, and the lock fell into the snow. Jonas unwound the heavy chain and let it drop. He took a deep breath, drew the hunting knife from the sheath on his belt, and slowly pushed the door open. It creaked on ancient, rusted hinges, revealing an interior shrouded in near darkness. The air that wafted out was stale and frigid, carrying a sickeningly sweet scent of illness and neglect. Atlas darted inside without hesitation, his nails clicking on the dusty floorboards. Luna followed swiftly. They ran straight through the small main room toward a partially open door at the back. Jonas followed, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A rickety table with a single chair, a few cans of food on a dusty shelf, a worn-out sofa with its springs showing. The only light came from the dying red embers in a small fireplace. His senses on high alert, Jonas followed Atlas and Luna to the back room, pushing the door open with the toe of his boot. This room was even darker, the only window covered by a tattered, threadbare blanket, but he could make out a shape on a narrow bed, a figure lying motionless under a thin pile of blankets. Atlas was at the bedside, whining softly, gently nudging the figure with his nose. Luna was beside him, whimpering. Jonas crossed the small room in 2 strides and tore the blanket from the window, allowing the fading twilight to flood the space, and his heart stopped. On the bed lay an elderly woman. Her face was gaunt and pale as bleached bone, her white hair a wild, tangled mess around her head. She was frighteningly thin, her body little more than a skeleton beneath the worn fabric of her clothes. But it was not her emaciated state that caused Jonas to gasp. It was the heavy metal handcuff clamped around her left wrist, its chain bolted directly to the iron bed frame. The skin beneath the cuff was raw and bleeding, a testament to her desperate, futile struggles to break free. He set his rifle against the wall and rushed to her side. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" He reached for her other wrist, his fingers searching for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter against his fingertips, weak and irregular. Her skin was ice cold. This was Sarah, Atlas's and Luna's owner, and she was dying. He looked from the woman's still face to the dogs, who were now licking her hand with heartbreaking tenderness. All the pieces clicked into place. The cruelty, the desperation, the impossible journey through the snow. Atlas and Luna had not been running from something. They had been running for someone. Time seemed to warp in the small, frigid room, for a Marine trained to react in seconds. Jonas felt frozen, not by the cold, but by the sheer, calculated cruelty of the scene before him. Sarah's breathing was a shallow whisper, a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. The immediate, overriding priority was to free her. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Ma'am, I'm going to get you out of this," he said, his voice low and steady, hoping the sound could penetrate her semi-conscious state. The lock on the handcuff was old and simple, designed more for intimidation than high security. Jonas pulled a multi-tool from a pouch on his belt. With the focused precision of a man defusing a bomb, he worked on the lock's mechanism. Atlas and Luna watched, their bodies tense coils of muscle, low whines escaping their throats as they nudged Sarah's limp hand. After several tense moments that stretched into an eternity, there was a satisfying click. The cuff sprang open. Jonas carefully chafed her frozen wrist, trying to restore circulation, his touch as gentle as he could manage. He then turned his attention to the immediate threats: hypothermia and dehydration. The embers in the main room's fireplace were a faint, mocking glow. He rushed out, added the last of the dry kindling he could find, and blew on them until a weak flame flickered to life. It was not much, but it was a start. Returning to the back room, he unrolled the mylar emergency blanket from his pack. The crinkle of the foil sounded deafeningly loud in the silence. He wrapped it around Sarah's frail body, creating a cocoon to reflect what little body heat she had left. Next came the water. He knew he could not give her much at once. He uncapped his canteen, poured a small amount into the lid, and gently cradled her head. "Just a little, ma'am, just a sip," he urged. He touched the cold metal to her cracked lips, and instinctively she drank. A faint, raspy sound in her throat. He gave her another sip, and then another, before pulling away. It was enough for now. With the immediate crisis managed, Jonas needed to understand what had happened here. He needed a name. He needed to know the full story. He scanned the squalid main room, his eyes searching for anything that could offer a clue, and then he saw it. On the rickety table, half hidden beneath a dirty rag, was a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary, its cover warped by damp, and its pages swollen. He picked it up with a sense of reverence and dread. He sat in the single, wobbly chair by the newly rekindled fire, with Atlas resting his head on his boot and Luna curled at his feet, and opened it. The handwriting inside was elegant at first, but grew shaky and desperate as the pages turned. The first entry was dated 3 months ago. My nephew Dylan brought me up to the old hunting cabin today. He said it was for a weekend retreat, a chance to get away from the city. He has been so attentive lately, ever since he fell into those financial troubles. Jonas's jaw tightened. He flipped forward a few pages. He's not letting me leave. He told me this morning. He said he knows about the land, about the mining survey from last year. He knows the original deed is all that matters. Since the county records office burned down in 1998, he wants the papers. He says, I owe him that. Our family's legacy belongs to him. I told him he would get nothing. He just smiled and locked the door. The cold fury in Jonas's gut intensified. He read on, the entries becoming a heartbreaking chronicle of despair. Sarah wrote about the cold, the hunger, the gnawing loneliness. She described Dylan's visits, how he would bring just enough food and water to keep her alive. He was not just imprisoning her, he was methodically breaking her will. He enjoys this. One entry. Read. The words, barely legible. He sits in this very chair and eats a hot meal in front of me while I shiver. He tells me all he needs is my signature, or for me to tell him where I've hidden the deed. He says he can wait. The cruelty is the point. It is not just about the money anymore. It is about power. Jonas felt a surge of sickness. He knew that kind of evil. He had seen it in the eyes of men in faraway lands. He turned the page, and his breath caught in his throat. Dylan came today in a rage. He had been drinking. Atlas and Luna tried to protect me, my brave, beautiful boys and girls stood between us and would not back down. Dylan kicked them, and then he took a piece of rope. I cannot write what he did. I heard Atlas's and Luna's cries, and then there was silence. Dylan came back in, his hands bloody, and said the mutts wouldn't be a problem anymore. He dragged Atlas and Luna outside and left them in the snow. I pray he was wrong. I pray my boys and girl managed to run, to find someone, anyone. They are my only hope left. Jonas closed his eyes. The image of Atlas and Luna collapsed on his doorstep, searing itself into his mind. They were not just strays caught in a storm. They were messengers, heroes who had survived the unthinkable to complete their final mission. He gently closed the diary. The entire ugly story was laid bare. A desperate man named Dylan, driven by greed and debt, torturing his own flesh and blood for a piece of paper. Jonas looked from the diary to the still form on the bed, and then to the loyal dogs who had not left her side. His own quest for solitude felt like a selfish indulgence in comparison. His war had ended, but theirs was still being fought, and now he was a part of it. His mission was no longer about escape. It was about protection. He would be the wall that stood between them and the monster in the woods. He settled into the chair for a long watch, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, with Atlas's and Luna's steady breathing, a comforting rhythm in the dark. The night was far from over. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the slow consumption of the logs in the fireplace. Jonas remained vigilant, a sentinel in the oppressive silence of the cabin. He had moved Sarah, still wrapped in the mylar blanket, onto the lumpy sofa in the main room, closer to the life-giving warmth of the fire. She had not stirred. Her existence, a fragile flicker in the vast, cold darkness. Atlas and Luna lay on the floor at her feet, living, breathing guardians, their heads on their paws, but their ears alert to every creak and groan of the old cabin. The night was at its deepest and darkest when Atlas's head shot up, a low, guttural growl, vibrating in his chest, a sound of pure menace that was entirely different from his earlier whines of concern. Luna mirrored his stance, a sharp bark escaping her. They rose to their feet in a single fluid motion, the fur along their spines bristling. They positioned themselves squarely in front of the sofa, their bodies solid walls between Sarah and the door. Jonas was instantly on his feet, the rifle in his hands. He moved silently to the side of the single front window, peering through a crack in the wood. At first, he saw nothing but the ghostly moonlit expanse of snow. Then a figure emerged from the tree line, a dark silhouette moving with purpose toward the cabin. The man was carrying a duffel bag. Dylan. Jonas's heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear but with a cold, focused rage. He checked the chamber of his rifle. He was ready. The footsteps crunched in the snow, stopping just outside the door. There was the sound of a key scraping in the lock. Jonas said. The door swung open, letting in a blast of frigid air that made the fire dance wildly. Dylan stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots. He was a man in his late 20s, with a weak chin and restless, shifty eyes that darted around the room. He wore an expensive winter jacket,